Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Russ, for everything you've done to get me here. I appreciate it, and I hope you will be as interested as I am in this topic. There we go. Okay. So my recent research stems around the Armenians that were born in historic Armenia, all time periods after the genocide. I'm going to, in Philadelphia I read my paper, and I'm not going to read you an academic paper, I'm going to talk about it with you so that it makes it a little bit more interesting and engaging. These are Armenians, and all the pictures you'll see here are of Armenians that are living in different parts of historic Armenia. So what happened to the Armenians as a result of the genocide? The traditional narrative is oftentimes that all Armenians perished through various means. Okay? No one survived. And those who did survive settled in the diaspora, moved on to Lebanon or Syria, Haleb, or Paris, or the United States, and we are the diaspora. So the survivors are us. Some survived and fled to other countries, as I just said, and other Armenians were left behind. Well, what happened to those other Armenians? In reality, there were thriving pockets of Armenians, of Armenian communities in the very places where the genocide took place, from the end of the genocide until today. Okay? How many of you knew that there were Armenians still living in our Kharpert and in our Gesaria? Okay. It's usually not known unless it's people that have first-hand experience or they have encountered people that have been that have come from there. So this was very interesting. And I have to say, one of the reasons I got interested in this is when I met my husband, I was shocked, absolutely shocked, to hear that he was born in Sepastia. He wasn't just Sepastatsi. He was born in Sepastia in 1956. And I said, "Chiganada, you mean your grandparents?" He said, "No." So his parents and he and his relatives, cousins, were born in Sepastia. And so this was very interesting to me, and it opened up a window to another part of our history that we didn't really talk about or know about, actually. And it's more in recent years that people have been interested in looking at this lost population, or unstudied population, rather, not lost. Okay. Based on oral histories of the descendants of genocide survivors, Western Armenia, I explore the following questions. Okay, these are the first questions that come to mind when I hear that there are pockets of Armenians living there. How did the Armenians live amongst the perpetrators of the genocide? How did consecutive generations maintain their language, traditions, religion, cultural heritage? And what is Armenianness for this forgotten population? So I interviewed, actually I've done more than 25 interviews, but the ones I'll be discussing are related to the ones mostly from Sepastia. So 25 interviews were conducted. Most were born in Sepastia because it was easier to start with my husband's family, relatives, friends, and get their experiences of how they lived there. What was life like as an Armenian living in the places where they were born. Interviewees ranged in age between 50 and 95. And their ages, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time seeing the PowerPoint. I wonder if we can move it closer. Can we move the table closer? It might be able to fit better on this screen. Can
you bring it forward?
I think it might be an easy solution, and that way everyone can just. Okay. Yes, I think that's better. Good? Okay, and then okay. Okay. Okay, so interviewees' ages, when they moved out of the eastern provinces, varied between 7 and 55. So it's a long time living there. That's okay. That's okay. Perfect. You're brilliant. Thank you. Okay, this picture, this map is Sepastia or Sivas, as many of you know, and there's the city of Sivas or Sebastian, and there's a province. And within the province, there are many villages and towns that the various interviewees were from. Thank you. These are some of the faces of the interviewees. My husband is in the bottom corner. My mother-in-law is on the top corner. Many are relatives. My own personal cousins are in the middle. And they're all somehow related or not, but they were all born and they lived there for a considerable amount of time where they understood how life was there. So interviewees were asked about very different things. I tried to think of as many things that I could that's related to life there so that we could get a picture, a window into their lives. Family origins. I wanted to know where they were from, where they knew that they originated from. Were they always from Sepastia? Did the family who came there, did they end up there after the genocide and then consecutively new generations were born there? Family history, including the genocide years. A lot of these people know the histories of their parents or grandparents and how they survived the genocide, and then continue to live there. Family and household structure. Who lived in the household? Who was the head of the household and such? Religion. I asked about how they practiced religion, how they practiced the Armenian religious traditions. Education. Were they able to get educated? And it's interesting how I was very surprised at some of the answers that I got on that one. Apparently, many of them told me Armenians could go to school in certain areas, not all of the areas, but in certain areas, they were permitted to go up until like 3rd grade, and then they couldn't go anymore. There is a systematic way of preventing the Armenians from becoming more educated. And they also, the government also made the skilled Armenian workers become teachers and teach their skills that they were the masters of, the experts of, to the non-Armenians, to the Turks, to the Kurds, mostly the Turks, so that they would obviously progress and take over. Because the genocide had a lot to do with the economy as well as other things. Language. I asked about language. Neighborhoods and neighbors and neighborhoods. Did they live with mixed neighbors with varying ethnicities, or did they kind of congregate, with each other in pockets of ghettos, I will call it, just because of proximity? Or how did it work? Social life. Births, baptisms, weddings, and funerals. How did they do that? We're Christian. They're not. So how did this play out in the places? Traditions, courts, and legal status. So whatever I could think of, I tried to ask. In looking, what I found out after many of the interviews and what I found out was that in order to gauge Armenianness, what I was looking at was how these interviews open a window to the Armenians and who survived, and how did they maintain their Armenianness? Now, Armenianness is a vague word. How do you gauge that? How do you qualify that? And in order to do that, you have to first define it. So the way I defined it, and I kept this as the standard, I framed the definition of Armenianness using Ani Bakalyan's concept, which she posits as a continuum with traditional Armenianness at one end and symbolic Armenianness at the other. So after learning about this population of Armenians, I wanted to understand how did they gauge themselves? How did they identify? What is Armenianness for them? And using Ani Bakalyan's framework, the end of each continuum was the traditional Armenianness, and this meant that, and we can go to the next slide, that the traditional Armenianness meant that people were living their lives in accordance to traditional values and cultural and behavioral patterns. They were Armenian. They didn't have to think about it. Symbolic Armenianness, on the other hand, was it was rational, it was voluntary, it was situational, it was thought through. Okay, so with assimilation, each new generation defines Armenianness through conscious decisions. There's a thought of how do we become and maintain our Armenian identity, whereas the traditional Armenianists, they don't. They just are. They just live that way. So, and this goes from being Armenian to feeling Armenian. Okay? And Ani Bakalyan uses this definition to describe Armenian Americans and how each generation from the previous generation has a conscious effort to maintain their identity. We are here today as a conscious effort to participate in the Church Badarak, to be together, to celebrate the church's anniversary. We are doing what we think we need to do to maintain our identity. There's a conscious effort here. The traditional view back then would have been, you just do it because that's what you do. And for us, surrounded by in a non-Armenian majority place, there's a conscious effort to do it, and that's how she distinguishes that. So this is what definition I used. So the Armenians who lived in historic Armenia after the genocide follow the same shift from traditional Armenianness to symbolic Armenianness, similar to Ani Bakalyan's Armenian Americans. My argument in this paper, in this research, is that after the genocide, the Armenians living in the homeland are very similar and going through the same, very similar process of identity and not detachment, but dynamic identity, moving away and from the previous generation, very similar to Armenian Americans, where the first generations are more without thought, and the further generations are thoughtfully trying to maintain their identity against the odds of being in a non-Armenian place, and I don't want to call historic Armenia a non-Armenian place, but after the genocide, it certainly changed, and that's what I'm going to try to show you how it changed, what it was that changed. Okay. Comparing demographics, environment, and culture. So America is pretty much the same as post-genocide Eastern Turkey. In both places, Armenians are a minority. After the genocide, Armenians were a minority, even in their own 100% Armenian villages. After the genocide, it was no longer that way. They were a minority. They were mere specks on the map of pockets of Armenians' houses here and there. So I assert that the Armenian ancestral homeland, forever changed by the genocide, parallels a foreign country to which Armenians immigrate, learn to adapt, and try to maintain their Armenianness as best as they can, thus transitioning from traditional to symbolic Armenianness. This is in Aintab. This is a picture I took. Surpas Vazadzin, Armenian church, now a mosque. So their surroundings are changing. It's not their familiar church anymore. Things are changing, the environment is changing, demographics are changing. Go ahead. Populations of Sepastia and Sivas before 1915, and then you have that there's over 100,000 Armenians just in the Sivas province, with 46 towns and villages. By 1950, 2,500. By 1970, 300. And 2015, 100. I think about 25 or so homes that we know for sure are Armenians that still live there today. The environment has changed drastically post-1915 in historically Armenian provinces. The landscape is filled with schools, places of worship, and markets of the dominant group, similar to the United States or other foreign countries where Armenians immigrate. The dominant group dictates the culture, where their music, language, and dress are the prevailing norm. The sounds are also different. The language of the dominant group resonates all around. With consecutive generations, there is a departure from Armenian language. This departure raises another very important issue, that of linguistics. I'm sorry, could you go back to that one? I didn't. Okay, so how did they survive? Many converted to Islam rather than die. Many were kidnapped and sold as servants, later ending up in orphanages. Friendly neighbors hid others, and some were kept because they were needed for their skills. This is the population that survived. There were also, I have to say, there were also those, not everyone who survived converted. There were many that did not convert. For example, the ones that were kept because their skills were needed, they did not convert. So this is the population we're talking about. This is Divrig, a village in Sepastia, 100% Armenian village in 1915. I interviewed a lady from Divrig. Her name was Digin Navat, and she was from the village. Actually, Divrig is the bigger area, kind of the county, if you will, and the village name was Khornabil. And the inhabitants, she says, were 100% Armenian. And she gives a figure of 4 households left in the 1930s. That's it. So she is now back. She's living in her hometown where everything changed. She's no longer the majority. She's now the minority. So how does she stay? How does she keep her identity? Baron Sarkis from Manjaluk. Next one. This is also Digin Navat's Armato. She lived in the village that she was born in, and the village that she went to live with her husband to form her own household. So this is Armato, same person, and these are her children. The next. Okay. Manjaluk is another place in Sepastia, another village. The lady I interviewed is the little girl that's in this picture, who, when I interviewed her, she was already in her 70s, 80s, something like that. And this is also the same. I interviewed 3 people from this family, and it was very interesting. So Baron Sarkis from Manjaluk, one of Kangal's villages, estimated that 80 to 90 households were left in the 1930s, and only 14 by the 1940s. next one. And this is Digin Usyan, who I interviewed her parents. Her parents are the lady at the end and the man who has his head wrapped. Those are her parents. And she happens to be my husband's uncle's wife. So these would be the in-laws. And they owned a lot of land in the day, and of course much of it was taken at whenever the government or military wanted to take property. It was not difficult for them, they took it. And he was very well off. But it was very interesting how they used to keep the locals happy. They would entertain them, they would host them, they would be very hospitable, anything to keep them happy so that they won't be looking at how wealthy he's getting. And a very interesting story was that he would go to the bank and borrow money along with all the neighbors to show that he also needs money. He's not that wealthy. But 2 days later, he would go and pay it off. So that it's the way they lived with their neighbors. Digin Usyan, the town of Kangal, estimates 60 houses by 1940s, and by 1950, 3,000 Armenians were living in Sepastia. And that would have been for all of Sepastia, not just one particular place. So very recently even, I mean, the 1950s isn't that far. It is far, but not that far. People from that time period are still with us. Okay. According to the caretaker of St. Gregory, the Illuminator Church of Gesaria. This is him, and that is his wife. The next picture is his wife and his daughter. And this is I think the biggest, no, not the biggest church, but a very big church in Gesaria. Because Giragos in Diyarbakir and Ikranagir is the largest. This church was the one that continually was open, I believe. That's what they said. Last Armenian, except for 2 others, he said, like him, in Gesaria right now. So these are the last ones. And he sent his daughter to school in Istanbul, in Bolis, to get an Armenian education to be with her people. So it gets difficult to maintain your identity when the numbers are dwindling too. And an intentional attempt is to send their daughter off for a whole year miles away to Istanbul to get an Armenian education. So that would be symbolic Armenianness. According to, I already said that. Digin Arusyak is another person. And I don't know, I think I do have a picture. Next one. This is in Sepastia. Actually, this is Digin Arusyak. When I interviewed her, she was 82 years old. That's the girl in the picture, in the front, the tall girl. And that is, I took a random picture when I was in Sepastia, and it ended up being her house. And I didn't know. I had no idea that was their house. They're a relative of my mother-in-law's, and when they saw it, they said, "Oh my God, that's our house." So I had no idea. They lived amongst not all Armenians. They were not living in pockets together. The neighbors were non-Armenian, but they were Turk. Most in Sepastia were mostly Turkish. Digin Arusyak was born in 1926 in the city of Sepastia, where a larger concentration of Armenians lived. She tells of how Vartivar was celebrated with great enthusiasm. She was so excited about telling us how they kept that tradition. They looked all year long, they waited for Vartivar because it was such a festive occasion. And all the Armenians would follow this tradition. Young and old, all would participate in throwing pails of water on each other. It is noteworthy that for 2 months in the summer, the majority of Armenians from the city of Sepasya traveled to Chermik and lived under tents, like camping. Vativar would have been celebrated during this time when Armenians were together in a large group and a majority of the campsite. So you can see when they're together and in large groups, the traditions are much more, they celebrate it openly together, and the Turks or any other groups are not part of it, they're not there. And so Vartavar would be celebrated during this time period when Armenians were there together at the campsite. In contrast, Digin Novart of Hornavil points out that the entire village was Armenian speaking before the genocide. By the time she was born, the few Armenian families left were adapting to the new language, similar to immigrant Armenians learning the language of the host country. While learning Turkish became priority, Digin Novart's father took time to teach his children to read and write Armenian at home. This choice was situational, as there were no longer functioning Armenian schools or churches. So already the next generation is moving towards this symbolic Armenianness, the intentional, effortful action of trying to preserve and maintain their identity, considering the surrounding is no longer what it used to be, where they didn't have to think about it before. So the landscape changed for Armenians after 1915. Their schools and churches were confiscated. The buildings were used as stables or for storage by the military. The boys were being I guess, there we go. Okay. The schools and churches were being confiscated. The buildings were used as stables for storage or military. Often, stones beautifully cut and carved, the Turks found to be perfect material to build their mosques, schools, bridges, and other infrastructure. The cemeteries' headstones were not even exempt. Digin Bartui of Pashakul, an all-Armenian village before the genocide, remembers witnessing the newly settled Gochmen from Bulgaria, carving out the names of the deceased and cutting the headstones to be used to build the first mosque in their old village. The landscape is changing, the environment's changing. She recalls, "We were just children. We would stand there and watch. They would say these stones would make a good jami, mosque." Digin Kohar of Tabra recalls the powerful blast of the dynamite used to explode the St. Surkrikor Lusavoric church in 1959-1960 in the city of Sepasya. It was built so well that the stones were intact, hanging from the steel frame. The landscape now is adorned by a bank, a government building, where the church once stood. Again, it all changes. The picture there, if you could go back, is of, I believe that was, again, the Antep church in Sulpasvazazin in Antep. The Turkish flag drapes the altar. Atatürk's picture replaces the cross over the arch, and bullet holes appear on the facade. So what was familiar to them is now something else. This is now a jami, a mosque, and they had, the imam was there teaching the children when we went, and I just wanted to go in like it was my church. And again, I was respectful, and I didn't, because I guess we respect other religions. And I did not do that. I had our guide go in and take pictures from the inside, but the door was open, I could peek through. After the genocide, Armenians in Turkey tried to live under the radar as best they could in order to avoid any potential problems with their Muslim neighbors. There is a saying that came up frequently. I can't tell you how many times this came up in the interviews. So many of them said this. Anyone know Turkish in here? Okay. I'm going to read it in 3 languages. They would say, onlara dokunmasam senden iyisi yok. Yete irens chitutnas kezme lava chiga. Which means, as long as you don't touch them, there is no one better than you. So they got along. How many of them would say, oh, we get along, there was no problem, everything was perfect. I mean, we would be very friendly, they'd be very friendly. As long as you don't step on their toes, everyone got along and they were perfect neighbors. As long as you don't step on their toes. So that was how they maintained the relationship, how they survived amongst the perpetrators. And with the aftermath of the genocide, first-generation survivors refrained from sharing their recent history with their children as a means of protection. They felt an urgency to deprive their children of the horrors of the genocide until they were older. In particular, and I know this because my mother-in-law has told me this, whoever I've met has told me this, even in Istanbul today, they don't share the story of the genocide. They're very cautious what they tell their own Armenian families, what they tell their children at a young age, at an early age, because children cannot gauge. Children tell the truth. What they hear, they will share, they will talk about. They don't know the politics of being cautious and careful. It doesn't take much that, other than a child saying, this is what happened, this is what your grandparents did to my grandparents, or whatever. And they would get beaten up, and the mothers would come and attack, would jump on, as a matter of speaking. So problems could arise, and they want to avoid all of this. So people, they don't share this information until later. They felt an urgency to deprive their children of the horrors until they were older. In particular, Digin Bartui, born in Kutlukaya, and who grew up in Kashakyur villages of the Kazakh Sepastia, states, as other interviewees, that the history of the genocide was not shared with the boys and was shared with the girls only when they were just a little older. In some cases, after they were married. So according to them, the boys, being too compulsive, could get into fights with the Turkish boys. Baron Armenak from one of the Sepastias villages and Baron Hagop of Gesaria's Gigi village, who happens to be Tanya Dadyan's grandfather, who I also interviewed from Gesaria, had similar experiences. Each in their respective villages, while playing outside, were called gavur by the Turkish boys on the streets. Both went home to their mothers in tears. Baron Hagop says that was the only incident he encountered where he was set apart from the others while living in Gesaria. So again, as long as you don't touch their toes, step on their toes, you're fine. Baron Hagop says, Baron Armenak's family, on the other hand, were converted Armenians. They practiced Islam and behaved as model Muslims. They all had Muslim names. Although the village knew which families were converted Armenians, Baron Armenak as a child did not know he was Armenian until he ran home one day when his mother, about an incident. That is when his mother told him, "You are Armenian." By the way, that family moved to Istanbul. All children, they converted back on paper, and all children were baptized and are part of the church and went to the Armenian schools. As soon as they get back into an environment where they are surrounded by more majority, something more familiar, more similar, they feel more comfortable, and then they get back to more traditional ways of living. Again, maybe moving back from the continuing from the symbolic Armenianness back to the closer to the traditional Armenianness. So Ani Bakayan suggests that economic status is also prelude to determining Armenianness. So can we? I'm sorry. Oh, this is the cemetery in Tavra, which is just outside of the city of Sepastia. It's an Armenian cemetery. Is there a next one? the Kasparian Church. I'm going to get back to something in just a minute. And, okay, this is the Ustian and her family again. Within one family, you will find Christian and Muslim siblings. The Ustian is the lady right behind the old gentleman that's sitting. Her sister with the baby was called to the next door neighbor and to help her with cleaning. Just needed help with the rug, cleaning the rug. You know how they throw on the balcony and they pound out all the dust. As soon as she goes there, and that's it. Because that girl has a brother, and her name is now ruined because she went over to that house. And they wanted her for a bride, and she was kind of tricked, and her father would not take her back because her name was ruined now. She had been into the house of a Turkish family who had a male in the house, and that was that. So she ended up marrying him because that's what the other family's intention was. And for that reason, you lose, one person from the population. The family stayed close later on, but there are many mixed families this way. There's one family from Bitlis that moved to Istanbul. The younger brother, the younger child, went to the Tübrebank and is very Armenian, knows how to read and write Armenian, is very connected to the community, and then he has sisters who are Muslim and practice Islam and have married other Armenian converts, and they're very staunch Muslims because they're also afraid. So it's very difficult to change. Some people think life is easier to just go ahead and live amongst the same as the majority, and others will have that intentional effort to try to maintain their Armenianness through symbolic means, symbolic Armenianness. So there were a lot of many interesting, these are the two sisters. So Dinustian is Christian, Armenian, and she converted before she got married. On paper, they live as Armenians. They practice the Armenian traditions in the home, but outside they have to be careful. And that's her sister who is and lives as a Muslim. Go ahead. Same family again. They're all different. Yeah, they are all Armenian and practice Christianity. Go ahead. This being said, okay, hang on this one for a minute. This being said, with a little more openness in Turkey right now, a little more tolerance, we are seeing popping up for the past how many years now, co-patriotic organizations. How many of you would think that there is a Malatyatsi co-patriotic organization in the interior of where Turkey was, in Malatya, or Dersim, or Sasun and Mush? I mean, they are everywhere. They're Armenian organizations. Many of them don't speak Armenian anymore, but they are coming, there's an intentional effort because there's a little more leniency and tolerance, they're coming back and trying to maintain, they're getting back their identity. And again, we go back to that symbolic Armenianness where there is an attempt and a decision that this is what we want to do to maintain and keep what we have. We're going back to it, they're moving back from the continuum a little bit. And this, when I was there in 2013, we were, my friend and I were on our way to Hamshin, and we switched our path and we decided to go to Dersim, and this is Ovacık in Dersim, because we heard an Armenian dance group was there from Armenia to perform at their annual Munzur festival. And we go there, from the buses, from the bands come out with the Yera coin, and the t-shirts were, they were wearing the tricolor t-shirts. This area is not Turkish populated, it is Kurdish and Zaza populated. so things are changing. The Kurds also participated in the genocide, but they have also apologized, and they are taking measures to rectify certain things. They're writing the city names in Armenian as well as Kurdish and Turkish. Wherever you go now, you see the Armenian welcome in Armenian letters. They're small measures, but there's definitely a certain turn of events. They're also not the favorites of Turkey right now, or ever have been, as you know. So we went, and they presented the dances, our folk dances, and everyone, they couldn't get enough. This is a video, and I would, is it possible to play it? Because I don't know if I can, if you click on it, will it play? Because I would have loved to share that with you, and if it is not, I can pull it up. So basically, this is Armenians trying to move back to Armenianness in those areas.
I'm going to try to pull that up for you because I think you would enjoy this watching it. Later on, if there's time and I find it, we can play it later on. Are there questions? Is there anything that I can answer for you? There are many different. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. We're going to take questions. So these are just some of the things that I noticed with the preliminary interviews and in scrutinizing identity and Armenians with the population of the Armenians that were left behind. They certainly had very interesting experiences.
They certainly had very interesting experiences. They were not all the same experiences, but one common denominator was that Armenians living in a diaspora and putting in that intentional effort and moving towards a symbolic Armenianness, trying to maintain their identity by conscious decisions to do so. Whereas before, when they were a majority, it was not something they had to think about, it just was. And that was a comparison that I did between the two communities, what we do and what they do. Even though they are in our own homeland, it wasn't our homeland the way it was before the genocide, because all the factors changed. So, thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions.